Good morning, fellow truth seekers, and welcome to another discussion rooted in Genesis. In this case, a discussion that answers the question, what about the supposed evolution of man? Going to Britannica, really to define human evolution for us and get us started, Britannica says that human evolution is the process by which human beings developed on Earth from now extinct primates. Viewed zoologically, we humans are Homo sapiens, a culture-bearing, upright walking species that lived on the ground and very likely first evolved in Africa about 315,000 years ago. Now, there's a lot of information there that we're not going to go after yet. We're just letting Britannica define human evolution. They go on to say, there is abundant fossil evidence to indicate that we were preceded for millions of years by other hominids such as Ardipithecus and Australopithecus. We'll talk about, in particular, Australopithecus, as well as other species of Homo, and that our species also lived for a time contemporaneously with at least one other member of our genus, Homo Neanderthalensis, or the Neanderthals. Now, there is a lot there, but we're going to go after it. This is absolutely misleading and indeed misinformation. So let's get going. When we go to the History Channel, we see, or History on the web, we see pictures like this, the supposed march of the evolution of man. Now, you'll notice all we have are hand-drawn sketches. They clearly are advancing both in their ability to walk upright, less hair on the body, and they are slowly getting larger and larger. Their craniums are getting larger and larger, and they're getting more and more human-like. They go from dwelling naked like the animals to starting to wear clothes like man. This is the picture. What's interesting about this is you'll notice there's no labels here. On the web, there's no labels. So you can't go study who's who in this zoo. You just must accept that this is indeed the march of evolution. There's no way to even refute this because you don't have an example of what they're even pointing to. We have something that looks very chimp-like in the back, although he's walking nearly upright, to something we recognize as human in the front. This is what science says. This forces the question, our initial question as truth seekers, well, what does the Bible say? We looked at this last week, but we'll go ahead and review right now because I want us to briefly talk about what the Bible says about the evolution of man. Picking up in Genesis 1, verse 26, then God said, Elohim said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, as you look at this account, there's two things I want to draw your attention to before we leave this and get back to what modern evolutionary science has to say about the supposed evolution of man. But I want you to see what God says. Point number one, you'll notice that God says within the triune Godhead, and we talked about this in Sunday school, let us make man, verse 26. Verse 27, so God created man. Verse 27b, God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So the first point is that according to the Word of God, man is not the chance of time, slow processes that result in a monkey ultimately becoming a man. Rather, man is created supernaturally by a sovereign and all-powerful God. But there's another point I want you to see here. Man is not only created, but man is created in the image of the triune God. It is God who said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. Picking up in verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. You and I are not only the marvelous creative work of a sovereign God, But we are made in his image and in his likeness in many different ways, and we'll talk about that this week in Sunday school. But this is what God's Word had to say, or has to say, about this matter, totally in opposition with what modern evolutionary science has to say. This is National Geographic. You'll notice this character. He's neither monkey-looking nor man-looking. He's meant purposefully to look like a hybrid. He's meant to look like something that's between, something that's in between. So is this guy in our family tree. He looks slightly human and slightly primate. I would argue no, there's nothing like this in the rock layers at all. Only supposed things, and we can build that case rather easily, and we'll do that today. Now, we could end right here in all honesty. The Bible is crystal clear. Man was created as man, no evolution, and man was created in God's image. Before we advance, though, there's some things I need you to know about the supposed evolution of man, sort of some of the underbelly stuff. There are some in the field with an agenda. And that agenda is to prove monkey to man evolution and to prove it at all costs. Now, you may be wondering why. Well, obviously, we talked about this to some degree in Sunday school. The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God. They're foolishness unto him, neither can he know them. The natural mind, the natural man, is at enmity with God. He's not subject to the laws of God, neither indeed can he be. The natural man, apart from being born again, is trying to still his conscience and prove to himself that there is no God. So this behavior is not surprising, but it's even worse than that. There are rewards, indeed rewards, book deals, speaking engagements for any who can bring forth evidence of monkey to man evolution. So it isn't like there's all these people out there digging for the truth. In many cases, they're digging to prove a point to their own conscience that they don't have to answer to God, even though their conscience is declaring to them that they do. Even the heavens are declaring the glory of God, but they're suppressing all that, and they're seeking to prove in their own mind, at least, that there's no God, and they're not answerable to him. But then equally, there's a lot of money, a lot of clout, a lot of opportunity to be had if you can prove monkey to man evolution. This is a biology textbook, and this is really, they're all similar. This one's very specific in what it's teaching, but you can see the supposed advanced of man going all the way back here to Afarensis, through Africanus, through Homo habilis, Homo erectus, ancient or archaic Homo sapiens. We have Neanderthals kind of branching off. That's a later idea. And then we have Homo sapiens, and you'll notice Cro-Magnon man is sunk into that story. That's right out of Biology Living Systems textbook, The Ascent of Man. Now, before we follow the supposed evolutionary progression in the monkey to man diagram, I want to be clear on one point and then show you a few things, and then we're going to get at it. The only two places we find this chain, this clear chain, like I just showed you, is on the internet, you saw History Channel, and in our textbooks. You will not find it in the fossil record. You will not find it in the fossil record. It isn't there. But there's something else I need to show you as well, and that's evolution's hall of shame. Now, as I take you into this hall of shame, it's not to poke a finger in the eye of evolutionists over some of the shenanigans that have happened in the past as it relates to the evolution of man. And I suppose maybe to some degree it is that. But it's more than that. That is not the major reason. I need you to see how hard some people, not all people, some people are working to prove this theory is true. I need you to see how far some people will go to prove something is true, even though they don't have the evidence at that particular time that says it's true. And so let me take you into evolution's hall of shame. The first one we'll start with is Piltdown Man. He's our first entry. Piltdown Man was discovered in 1908 and 1912 in Piltdown, England. What they found was a portion of a skull, very human-like, and a portion of a lower jaw that was more ape-like. This discovery was made by a man named Charles Dawson, and he declared that these were from an ape man that was around 500,000 years old. This was validated by Britain's leading scientists, including Grafton Elliott Smith, autonomous Sir Arthur Keith, and British Museum geologist Arthur Smith Woodward. At the time the discovery was announced in 1912, New York Times ran this headline, and I'll show it to you in a second. Quote, "Darwin's theory proved true." Then for the next 4 decades, Piltdown Man would be in every evolutionary textbook, encyclopedia, magazine. He would be showcased and hosted everywhere. So again, here is what they found. A part of a skull that was clearly human-like, and a part of a lower jaw that was clearly ape-like. There's what they found. The claim, 500,000-year-old intermediate length. Here's the New York Times article. This ran in December 22nd, 1912. You can see the box there. Darwin theory is proved true. Then for the period of the next 4 decades, Piltdown Man would be used as evolution's greatest showcase, featured in textbooks, encyclopedias, all over the place. It's also important to note this would be used in the 1925 Scopes trial as evidence for monkey to man evolution. Then, 4 decades later, in 1953, a group of scientists led by Kenneth Page Oakley attempted to use a new method of fluorine testing to get a more exact date on these 500,000-year-old bones. What the test showed them shocked them. The jaw was modern, and the skull was only 600 years old. Additional analysis soon confirmed the fluorine test. The jaw was really that of an orangutan, where some of the teeth had been filed and the parts had been filed to sort of help erase its simian origin, and then sections had been broken off. Equally, both the skull cap and the orangutan jaw that had been altered had been treated with some type of iron and salt mixture to give them the appearance of age. Here's a cover of the 1956 Reader's Digest, which was actually a reprint of the April 56 article in Popular Scientist, The Great Piltdown Hoax. The gig was up. The news was out. It was a complete hoax. New York Times had ran an article, Darwin Theory Proved True, featured in textbooks and encyclopedias. But then in 1953, a scientist studied the bones. Something else came out. For 40 years, it was in articles. For 40 years, it was in textbooks. For 40 years, it had been heralded as true. And it was a fraud. It was an amalgama. 600-year-old bones and an orangutan jaw. Now, at this point, most, if not all, believed that Piltdown Man was a purposeful fraud executed by one man, and that was Charles Dawson himself. Thus, Piltdown Man enters the Hall of Shame. But there's another entry we need to talk about in the Hall of Shame, and that is Nebraska Man. Nebraska Man was found in 1922 by paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn, an ardent evolutionist. He was shown a single tooth found in Nebraska by geologist Harold Cook. After examining it, Osborn claimed and declared that it belonged to an early ape man that he entitled Nebraska Man. Other paleontologists added to the research, agreeing that this was clearly a tooth from a transitional form. Meanwhile, in England, evolutionist Grafton Elliott Smith convinced the London News to publish an artist's rendering of Nebraska Man. So I bet you're wondering, what would you render Nebraska Man to look like off a single tooth? Well, here is how they rendered Nebraska Man. So here is what they found. A single tooth. Here is what they drew. A very human-like, very man-looking like homo. You can see his wife is also shown there. You can tell I guess that's a woman, and she's like preparing him dinner or something. And this was scientifically built off one tooth. By the way, this evidence was also used in the 1925 Scopes trial as evidence for monkey to man evolution. So Nebraska man, 1922 fossil evidence used to support evolution in the 25 Scopes trial. The claim, a 1 million year old intermediate link. The truth? Turned out to be an extinct pig, peccary, tooth. So in 1927, other parts of a skeleton were found, and according to these pieces, as well as similar teeth, all of a sudden we realized that Nebraska man was actually just a peccary, a small little wild pig. And so we now can reproduce a great rendering of Nebraska man, and it might look something like that. And of course, that's a modern pig. That's not a peccary, but you get the point. Thus, Nebraska man goes down into the history of the Hall of Shame. But there's another we need to talk about in the Hall of Shame, and that is Ramapithecus. So what was found? In 1932, jaw fragments, teeth, and some bones were discovered in Nepal on the bank of the Tanao River, and they were heralded as an intermediate between apes and men. The discoverer, G. Edward Lewis, claimed that the jaw was more like a human's than any other fossil ape then known, and it was a 14 million year old intermediate link between ape-like creatures and humans. What a claim. So there is what they found, and there is what they drew. Now, at some point, this should become embarrassing, but it's what happened next that's very interesting. So this was found in 1932, but in 1960s, it started gaining new attention, and in 1977, Time magazine ran an article. You can see the front of that cover, How Man Became Man. And in that article about Ramapithecus, here's what Time magazine says. Quote, Ramapithecus is ideally structured to be an ancestor of hominids. If he isn't, we don't have anything else that is. Well, there you have it. We've looked at this jaw. This is clearly a 14 million year old intermediate. It's what happened next that I need to tell you about. In 1970, a baboon living in Ethiopia was discovered with the exact same dental structure and similar morphological features as Ramapithecus. Not only was Ramapithecus dropped from the human line, Ramapithecus was dropped completely out of the evolutionary line. So the claim, a 14 million year old intermediate between ape-like creatures and humans. The truth, a baboon, a modern day baboon. Not 14 million years old, how about 14 years old? Thus Ramapithecus is dropped from the human line and all evolutionary charts, and Ramapithecus enters the Hall of Shame. So the summary of facts that I gave you about the Hall of Shame, and by the way, they're facts, they're not up for debate. Piltdown Man was a hoax. Nebraska man was a pig, but let's be honest, it was a hoax. No one can look at a tooth and draw a man. Ramapithecus, again, from a jaw, was an ape. It was all hoisted upon us by human beings with no evidence to support the claim. Now, what about the dates? We've just been talking about the things, but what about the dates? In every case, the dates, the ages are completely wrong. We'll talk more about that in the future. Now, as you think about this, there are other entries in the Hall of Shame, by the way, but I'm going to leave that alone, and we're just going to keep advancing the argument. But I do want to say something. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. If we would just believe what the Bible tells us, the Bible that gives us hundreds of prophecies about the coming Messiah, all accurately and completely fulfilled with mathematical, statistical impossibility, proving itself of divine origin. If we would just believe what that book tells us, we would be in a much better place. But let's get back to our discussion about the supposed evolution of man. So we're back to the textbook, and we'll start out there with Homo sapiens, and then in brackets it says Cro-Magnon man. Cro-Magnon man used to be viewed as a intermediate link between monkeys and current Homo sapiens. That is no longer the case. Almost everyone accepts Cro-Magnon man as an unnecessary taxonomy. He is, in other words, the Cro-Magnon man, fossils they find, evidence they find is nothing more than Homo sapiens. And as this textbook has done, they've sunk Cro-Magnon man into modern man. Now, Cro-Magnon man was initially discovered in France in 1868. He was presented as a brutish club swinger who lived somewhere between 10 and 40,000 years ago. That's all been erased. Everything points to completely human, and everything we found in anybody we thought might be Cro-Magnon is proven to be human. So that brings us next on our chart, and that is Neanderthals. Initially discovered in Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856, they were presented also as a true ape man. Very ape-like, but he walked upright like a man. The claim, it was an ancient ancestor to man, to modern Homo sapiens, that lived somewhere from 40,000 to 250,000 years ago. It is important to note here that his brain bucket is actually, on average, the ones we found, bigger than modern man. Not a lot bigger, 13%. Average male height is a little bit shorter than modern man. So he's a shorter, stockier version of modern man with a little bit bigger brain bucket. That'll be hard to describe in the advance of man, how his brain got bigger and smaller, but we'll leave that to some other time, and let's just continue to talk about Neanderthals. So this is the initial drawing, first found in Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856. This was the original drawing of the Neanderthal. You can see he's a very aggressive, ape-like looking man, stands upright like a man, but everything else about him is very ape-like, and he has a club so that he can whack you on the head, I guess, when you come by. So there is what is drawn. Now, when you see the skulls, you begin to realize, okay, now wait a minute. These things look identical to us. These things don't look close to us. The skull's a little bigger, but there's bigger skulls on the planet than the average size you see on the right. Again, as we look at this, we start getting the idea this does not look like a monkey. This looks like a man. Now, others will say this, but we now have evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead. They used tools. They used cosmetics. They played music. They collected minerals. And we also have evidence. Actually, I'm not going to say it. I'll let it come out in the video. But again, as you look at these skulls, you should begin to wonder, hey, these two guys look a lot alike. This next video clip is taken from Evolution's Achilles Heels and discusses Neanderthals.
But I don't know any paleontologist today that'd be able to draw that smooth transitional series we saw in previous decades. There are so many supposed species on the evolutionary tree of human history today, it's hard even to list them all, but let's just pick the most popular one, Neanderthal man. It was originally depicted as a half monkey, a distant relative, a real caveman. But today, everything has changed. Different paleontologists are trying to make the case that Neanderthal painted in caves, ceremonially buried their dead with their heads pointing towards the sunrise, made musical instruments, had the controlled use of fire, searched the landscape for rare minerals in order to make cosmetics. That is not the Neanderthal man I grew up with. And now that the genetics revolution is upon us, we've been able to construct 5 or 6 different Neanderthal genomes. There is strong evidence that modern man and Neanderthals interbred, meaning we are the same species by definition. Neanderthals are just a family group that lived in Europe and Asia after the flood. But the evolutionist says that these Neanderthal skeletons are tens of thousands of years old, but we're still finding DNA in them? As a geneticist, that's not supposed to be. That is shocking, but what's even more shocking is finding soft tissues in fossils that are supposedly much, much older.
Okay, so we had the discussion about soft tissue in fossils that are much, much older. But notice the evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens bred. That right there should settle the deal for all of us. So as we look at Neanderthals, they've been constructed to look ape-like. The brain capacity is just a little bit larger on average than the average human, but it's well within the average human range. They use jewelry, they use cosmetics, they played musical instruments, they created cave paintings. The skulls indicate they're capable of speech. They buried their dead. There was the initial picture. Here is how they would be rendered today. That is a totally different reconstruction of Neanderthals. And as you just saw in the video clip, there's a computer rendition of a Neanderthal child. Martin Lubenow said this: most anthropologists recognize burial as a very human and a very religious act. But the strongest evidence that Neanderthals were fully human in our species is that at 4 sites, Neanderthals and modern humans are buried together. Nicholas Komnenelis said this: analysis of Neanderthal DNA failed to demonstrate any significance from DNA of modern humans. Dave Phillips said this: Neanderthals were human. They buried their dead. They used tools. They had a complex social structure. They employed language, and they played musical instruments. Neanderthal anatomical differences are extremely minor and can be, for the most part, explained as a result of a genetically isolated people that lived a rigorous life in a harsh, cold climate, I would add, following the flood. David Mitten said this: despite the overwhelming evidence, the Neanderthals were simply a race of stocky humans, imaginative artists, with the encouragement of some evolutionists, have consistently rendered them astute ape men. Nothing could be further from the truth. In conclusion, they do have a protruding brow ridge. They are a stockier build, shorter extremity. We believe it clearly was an isolated population of people. They lived in a cold, harsh climate, but they were 100% human. They are Homo sapiens. Again, we found burial sites of them and us together, and there's very little difference in our DNA. Much more could be brought forward. In fact, I pulled out an additional video that I had here. We'll just leave it here because I don't want to spend too much time, but I want to give you enough that if you're interested, you're properly armed and you can go study it on yourself. But I would argue the conclusion at this point is clear about Neanderthals. And so that puts Neanderthal and sinks him into Homo sapiens. So let's look at the next one on our list, and that's Homo sapiens ancient, or Homo sapiens archaic. Initially discovered in 1891, they were presented as a supposed evolutionary linkage to modern Homo sapiens. It's an unofficial and highly debated taxon. The best description, if you're trying to describe the differences, their skull seems to slope a little bit. The brain capacity is a little bit smaller, but well within human average range. They have heavy ridges over their eyes, similar to Neanderthals. The rear of the skull is more rounded than Neanderthals. They have a long face, but their postcranial bones outside of the face identical to modern Homo sapiens. Supposedly they lived anywhere from 600,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. So one would wonder how these archaic Homo sapiens ever stopped reproducing. It's like all of them magically transformed into modern Homo sapiens in a way that we don't understand. They just were there and then gone, and I would argue they're all Homo sapiens. One could walk up to you today and you would have no reason to believe he's not fully human. Look at that skull. You can see a little bit of thickness in the brow, right? And most agree the taxon has no purpose or function. It runs alongside other taxons that were supposed to be in the evolutionary line. They're simply humans. And all but the most argumentative evolutionists would agree they should be sunk into the Homo sapien taxon. Now we'll discuss the date issue later. But going back to our textbook and having now sunk archaic or ancient Homo sapiens into Homo sapiens, we move on to Homo erectus. Homo erectus was initially discovered in 1891 and presented as a supposed evolutionary linkage to Homo sapiens, who walked upright. Now, supposedly, Homo erectus lived from 2 million years ago to 27,000 years ago. So you can see he's overlapping everybody. Homo erectus is overlapping archaic Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and even possibly modern Homo sapiens. Again, we'll talk more about these ages, which are complete fabrications, but understand even in their theory, this stuff is all overlapped. So Homo erectus, let's talk about him. So he's really one of the very, if not the most important link in the supposed bridge from the Australopithecines to the Homo sapiens. The problem is the evolutionary timeline, they live side by side with everybody. They live side by side with Homo habilis, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens. Again, this massive range that they've dated them really makes it ridiculous. And then equally, we have, at last check, and it could be more now, 78 fossil finds that are less than 30,000 years old. And again, these dates are all wrong, but understand they're stomping all over modern Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens. And most would agree they're just a slightly smaller version of Neanderthals, but still well within all of the size restrictions of man. So let's kind of put this in your mind. For Homo erectus, the skull size that we found has been between 780 and 1225 cc's. Neanderthals are on the upper range of that, 1200 to 1650 cc's. So now you're thinking, aha, they're different. Well, Homo sapiens are 1100 to 1300. Okay, right across that range. And what's interesting, modern Homo sapiens, 1400. And what's very interesting is if you take the range for modern humans today, it ranges from a low end of 700, which is below Homo erectus, to a high end of 2000, which is above anything we found in Neanderthals. You should be putting this together in your mind, that all of these things are human. These are just minor differences. And many scholars now agree that Homo erectus should be sunk into Neanderthals, which we already sunk into Homo sapiens. They've been found with tools, shelters, and even in one case, a 2-inch long piece of quartzite rock that appears to be carved into a human figure. Homo erectus are humans. They're made in the image of God. They're not another species. Let's head back to our textbook. So we've now sunk Homo erectus into Homo sapien. This whole thing is all the same people. Now we see this smaller looking human guy back here called Homo habilis. So Homo habilis was initially discovered in 1959 and supposedly lived between 2.5 million and 1.4 million years ago. He claims to be the earliest member of the genus Homo. And so let's see if that is true. There's Homo habilis. So in evolutionary timescales, it lived alongside Homo erectus, so it couldn't have evolved into a Homo erectus, but was contemporary with erectus. For years, there were many who believed it was a flawed taxon and that it contained a mixture of Australopithecine and Homo fossils. Then in 1986, the problem was solved when the first time portions of a Homo habilis skull were found with postcranial material. So we're not building this guy from different sites, but we find him in one site. And it turns out this guy, Homo habilis, is actually smaller than Australopithecines or Australopithecus afarensis, who we'll talk about in a moment, in particular Lucy. He's just barely over 3 feet tall and very ape-like. He does not belong to the Homo family at all. In fact, here's a rendition of as much as we've been able to build of his skull. This is a small, roughly 3 foot tall, chimpanzee-like animal. Homo habilis is in the wrong family completely, and anyone who looks at the evidence would determine that. He is not going to be sunk in anywhere. He belongs with the Australopithecus. And so with that, let's proceed back to our book. So Homo habilis now belongs to this string right here. So you'll notice as we follow the ascent of man, we'll leave these out, that's not man, we have Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, and Homo habilis. These guys, these primates, these chimpanzee-like animals are all likely the exact same thing and should be sunk into the same taxonomy. But let's advance the argument and let's talk about africanus. Most agree at this point in the equation that the africanus finds are nothing more than the Australopithecus afarensis, and that we could easily sink that taxonomy in. And there's no clear distinction to be talked about as it comes to that Australopithecus. And that brings us to Australopithecus afarensis, lovingly called Lucy. She was initially discovered in 1974, supposedly lived between 3.9 and 2.9 million years ago. She's named Lucy because that's the most famous find and the initial find in 1974 by Richard Leakey. Lucy as she had become lovingly known, Australopithecus afarensis. And there's a picture of me at the Creation Museum in 2008. I wanted to put this here, leave it here, because we're getting ready to go back to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter as a Sunday school class. I think we've got like 40 people going, maybe 30. I think 2 may have backed out. But I want you to see, I thought it was fitting to talk about it, but I want you to see what Richard Leakey found. Now, this is a replica. These aren't the actual bones. But as you look at what he found, number one, you can tell it's very small. This animal is very small. Spread, with its bones spread apart, it's shorter than me quite a bit. Its neck is extended, its spine is extended. This is a very small animal. But you'll notice there's no hands, only half of a pelvis, very little leg material, no feet. About 40, and so as you think about what's been found, again, found in 1974 by Richard Leakey, about 40% of the fossil is found, claimed to be around 3.5 million years old, claimed to be bipedal, that it walked upright, although we did not find any hands or feet in this initial Australopithecus find, as I showed you the actual replica of what was found. But Lucy has to walk upright. She has to have human-like feet, and she has to be at least 3.75 million years old. Now you should be thinking, well, Rich, why does she have to be all that? Well, let me show you. 2 years later, in 1976, when paleoanthropologist Andrew Hill and a colleague were tossing elephant dung at each other in Lotoli, nothing like having a good fun time in Tanzania, Hill dived out of the way because he did not want to get hit with this elephant dung, and he stumbled on what would turn out to be one of the wonders of prehistoric finds known as the Lotoli footprints, or the Lotoli Trail. I'll read the headline. Oldest footprints. This trail of footprints, belonging to perhaps 2 adults and a child, was found preserved in a bed of volcanic ash at Lotoli, Tanzania. It proves that hominids were walking upright some 3.75 million years ago. Okay, so let's talk for a moment. Let's connect all the dots for you because they may not be obvious. So this is found in the same general area as Lucy 2 years after Lucy is found. Lucy didn't have any feet or hands. This trail is radiometric dated, and don't worry, I'm going to do an entire series on radiometric dating. We brushed up against carbon-14 dating, slightly different, but similar. But I'm going to do a whole series on both carbon-14 and radiometric dating in the next week or two. But for the moment, they radiometric date this volcanic ash, which was buried in additional ash and thus preserved, and it dates at 3.75 million years ago. These are human-like feet, 2 adults and a child. Well, it can't be Homo sapiens 3.75 million years ago. That's not possible. What can it be? Well, it has to be the Australopithecus. Although we don't have feet and hands for them, they're the only thing we found in this area that can date back that far. It has to be them. This is the find of a lifetime. We've now connected the Lotoli Trail and the feet to this animal that we don't have any feet on. We're pulling this all together. It must be 3.75 million years old. It proves that Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, lived 3.75 million years ago and that she had human-like feet. She walked upright. This solves everything for us. This is amazing. This is Mary Leakey. In the National Geographic, 1979, she said this: the footprints are described as remarkably similar to those of modern man. The form of his foot was exactly the same as ours. Weight-bearing pressure patterns in the prints resemble human ones. Footprints so very much like ours. A 3.75 million year old upright walking chimpanzee-like man with human feet. We've got it. We've settled it. This is it. Russell Tuttle, University of Chicago, said this. He's done the most extensive study, by the way, on these footprints, as well as studying the footprints of 70 habitually barefoot people, and he said this. The Lotoli footprints, or the Lotoli prints, are indistinguishable from those of habitually barefoot Homo sapiens. Wow! Lucy had a completely Homo sapien foot. He further states, quote, the real problem, and in fact the only problem, is that to ascribe those fossil footprints to Homo does not fit the evolutionary timescale. There's the problem. Marvin Lubenow said this: there's no evidence that any other creature, past or present, had a foot exactly like the human foot. So you should be putting together something in your mind right now. Still sticking with Marvin, he says this in Bones of Contention: if the Laetoli footprints were not known to be so old, we would readily conclude that they were made by a member of our own genus, Homo. And I'm sorry, this was not Lubenow. This was Tuttle as quoted by Lubenow. Forgive me. Now, think as all this is occurring, we've uncovered these human-like footprints. We've uncovered this Lucy artifact. And this has all happened in 74 to 76. So we've got this small amount of bones, no hand or feet. But museums are stumbling over themselves to get something together built for the public. Leading the way is the St. Louis Museum, who drops a boatload of money to build an exhibit on the Australopithecines. Now keep in mind, we've got to remember what they had. There's what they had. And they had the Laetoli Trail, right? They're connecting the dots. The Laetoli Trail has to be made by this little creature. So what would they build the exhibit to look like? There's what they had. You can see they had very little below the waist. They didn't even have a full pelvis. They had no hands. Nothing that they could lay hold of and say the hands look like anything. Here's what they built. Yeah, shockingly human, right? I mean, if you shaved this little animal and hid her face, she would look like a modern human. This is a little modern human. Look at her feet and look at her hands. Look at how she's standing. Look at her gait. She is built to look like a human, a lot of hair, and a monkey face. That's what they created. That's what they did with these bones. And let's be honest, we understand why. We're connecting all the dots. They have to connect. There's what they built. Lucy has been portrayed as very human-like, but now that we found other members of this species, we now know this is not the truth. These next two video clips you're about to see are by Dr. David Mitten. He has his PhD in cell biology, and he served as a professor and lecturer for many years. He passed away in 2021. We were able to see him speak when we were at the Creation Museum the last time we were there. This video clip is from the DVD Lucy, She's No Lady.
What are the obvious misrepresentations here? Well, first of all, the hands and the feet. Let's just take a look at a little more detail here. There's the hand. You could play piano with a hand like this, or violin. Notice that the finger bones are straight. The whole hand has a very human-like quality. Apes have curved fingers. The finger bones, the phalanges, instead of being relatively straight, have a curvature to them, and so they have a kind of a meat hook looking hand that's quite distinctive, very well suited for being suspensory adapted or hanging from a limb, but not great for playing piano or pipe organ. Lucy here, the way she is shown, would be very good at the latter, not very good at hanging from limbs. Well, we know this isn't the case because even before the exhibit was made in the St. Louis Zoo, Stern and Sussman had published a paper in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, a rather sizable one at that. And in this paper, they looked at many of the Hadar Australopithecines, that is, of the type that Lucy represents, and they compared the curvature of her finger bones. Remember, Lucy herself didn't have finger bones, but there have been other specimens of Australopithecus afarensis that do, and so these bones have been compared, and you see them after the AL333 figure here, and the data points are here, and they're being compared to human, which is here, and other living apes. And what we see is, as you look at each of the different finger bones for living apes versus human versus Lucy, is that with an exceptional data point here and there, which may be a fragmentary fossil, the cluster is actually towards the most curved of the ape phalanges. So we could say that Lucy had highly curved fingers or phalanges by ape standards. the typical suspensory adapted type of hand. And this is not the hand shown on the creature that we have in the St. Louis Zoo. Now let's take a look at the feet. Well, first we'll say what Stern and Sussman concluded about the hand, then we'll look at the feet. Their conclusion was that a summary of the morphological and functional affinities of the Hadar hand leads inexorably to an image of a suspensory adapted hand, that is, hanging from a limb of a tree, surprisingly similar to the hands found in the small end of the pygmy chimp, common chimp range. So it would be completely inappropriate for anyone to paint or make a model of Lucy showing anything other than highly curved fingers. Another recent observation that was published is that these particular Australopithecines, which include afarensis, have been found to have locking wrist bones. And this is found in knuckle walkers. So that if you really wanted to show Lucy properly in the zoo, it would be a good idea to get her down on her knuckles, as any proper ape would be, doing a bit of knuckle walking. But that wouldn't get the impression across that certainly our zoo in St. Louis wants to get across, and I doubt many will go for it. Let's look at that foot. Have you ever seen a foot like that before? Sure you have. Kick off a shoe, take a look. Your foot is probably not quite that hairy, but this is a distinctly human foot. There is no animal on Earth that has a foot remotely like the human foot. So this may be another misrepresentation, and once again, Stern and Sussman looked at the toe bones, the phalanges of the toe, and looked at their curvature. And the curvature, again, is at the high end of the apes. Here are the apes, and you're getting more curved as you go to the right. Here is the Hadar Australopithecine, the Lucy-like creature, and human is way over here, the bottom one, way to the left. So highly curved fingers and highly curved toes. And their conclusion from all of this is that there is no evidence that any existing primate has long curved, heavily muscled hands and feet for any other purpose than to meet the demands of full or part-time arboreal or tree life. But this again would not be the way Lucy is displayed in our museum.
And so there, before I go to the next video, you can see that all of the evidence is out now. And the way Lucy is portrayed in many museums, models, books, is simply a misrepresentation of all the data. But continuing on, I want David Minton to show you one more thing.
The big problem, however, are the hips. As you know, all ladies are concerned about that, and so I would think Lucy is too. And let's look at these hip bones. There are really three bones that fit together to form the whole pelvis. I brought along the right piece of the human pelvis here. Fits right down here. And they're made of three different bones: the iliac part, the pubic part, which is right in front here, and right here is the ischium. These are the ischial tuberosities, and you are all sitting on your ischial tuberosities right now. That's what's supporting the weight through the gluteus maximus. Now, there's a distinct hip for apes and humans. And as far as I know, no overlap. You can't confuse an ape hip with a human hip. What's the big difference? Well, let me bring up a drawing that'll help to illustrate this. If you look at the top, that's a chimp. And at the bottom, that would be human. Notice the iliac blades of the human go front to back like this. It almost looks like a steering yoke on an airplane when you get them both together, right? As you look at it, isn't that sort of like a steering yoke on an airplane? See the handle here and the handle here, upside down? Whereas the ape, the iliac blades flare out laterally. So if I put this in place, in the human, this blade would be here, and the ape, it would be out here. Got the picture? This versus this. Now, why is that important? You need to have it this way if you're going to walk, as humans walk. Why is that so? My students tell me that I was at one time or another able to use almost every item of clothing on my body to illustrate things. Handkerchiefs can make muscles, and if we have a muscle that attaches to the iliac blade here called the gluteus medius, and that muscle comes down from here to here, right across there, and attaches to this bump on the femur. Now that's important because when we lift our left leg, think of an articulated dowel now. If you lift the leg, what's going to happen? If these are articulated joints at the hip, this hip's going to fall, isn't it? Lift the left leg, the left hip will fall. If I lift the right leg, the right hip will fall. What keeps this from happening? When I lift the left leg, the muscle that goes between here and here tightens up, and it keeps that from happening. See that? It's attached here. So if you don't have this orientation of the iliac blade, you cannot keep your posture as you walk perfectly even. Once again, you have to throw the weight back and forth to overcome this. Now on apes, the blade is like this. I've exaggerated a bit. The same muscle, gluteus medius, comes over the back side now. Notice that? It's going down the back. And apes have a center of gravity in front of their knees. They want to fall over forward anyway. And so this same muscle keeps them from falling further forward. So you can look at the pelvis and tell whether you're looking at an ape pelvis that cannot walk anything at all like we do, or a human pelvis. The big question is, what kind of pelvis does Lucy have? Well, Stern and Sussman said, the fact that the anterior portion of the iliac blade faces laterally in humans, he's talking at, this is facing lateral out here rather than over, but not in chimps is obvious. The marked resemblance of Lucy to the chimpanzee is equally obvious. So you get the picture? The creatures like Lucy have the ape orientation of the iliac blades. Now what are the evolutionists going to do about that? You're not going to believe this. Nova, have you heard Nova? There was a PBS Nova series in which Dr. Owen Lovejoy, a very distinguished, famous paleoanthropologist, was involved. And he's looking at Lucy's skeleton here, and he's lamenting the fact that the hips are all wrong. They're supposed to be human-like hips, so you can walk the way the Laetoli footprints showed she walked, but they don't look like human hips, they look like ape hips. What to do about this? Watch it. You'll get a big kick out of this.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together in later fossils.
So you see they were broken and they don't fit together properly. They did speculate in the program as to exactly who was responsible for breaking the hip, and current scientific evidence suggests perhaps a deer stepped on it. Here you can see a deer foot stepping on the bone. Isn't that a bummer? Let's see where it goes from here.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost.
This is a power saw, friends. You may want to put your goggles on.
Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster.
Notice he's removing whole parts, not just cutting.
He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Look how perfect. You can read a newspaper through the hole.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Yeah, now, this is what we call science. You can teach this in the public schools, but you can't criticize it, because if you do, that would be religious.
Sorry I left that last little bit on there for you, but you get my point about Lucy. Richmond and Strait said this: regardless of the status of Lucy's knee joint, new evidence has come forth that Lucy has the morphology of a knuckle walker. Stockstad said this: I walked over to the cabinet, pulled out Lucy, and shazam, she had the morphology that was classic for knuckle walkers. Oxnard said this: the Australopithecines known over the last several decades are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism. He goes on to say, all this should make us wonder about the usual presentation of human evolution in introductory textbooks. So to sum all this up, Lucy and the Australopithecines, no similarity in appearance to humans. Long arms, identical to chimpanzees. Jaws that are similar to chimpanzees. Upper leg bones similar to chimpanzees. Legs that are very ape-like. Brain size that is well below the smallest human skull cap we've ever found. Large back muscles for tree dwelling. Hands similar to pygmy chimpanzee. Fingers long and curved. Feet long and curved. Pelvis that is clearly that of something like a chimpanzee. Summing it all up, this is Richard Fangran and Calvin Smith. They're going to sum up the whole matter on Australopithecines.
Importantly, these creatures were overall not anatomically intermediate between humans and apes. This is based on a detailed, objective, computerized analysis of multiple coordinates on their bony skeletons by a team led by the distinguished evolutionary anatomist Charles Oxnard, recipient of the Charles R. Darwin Award for Lifetime Achievement in Physical Anthropology. The total anatomical coordinates of the three groups, modern apes, modern people, and the Australopiths, were plotted in a 3D morphometric space, as it was called. Evolutionary expectations were clear. People should cluster in a blob at one position in the space, apes at another, and of course Australopiths somewhere in between.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. But the Oxnard team found something quite different. The anatomy of this extinct group of primates was overall further from apes and people than those two groups were from each other. They did not walk upright, but had a unique rolling locomotion. Importantly, Oxnard did not regard them as ancestral to people. For decades now, there's been one variety of Australopith after another trumpeted as the latest spectacular find, allegedly supporting human evolution. But nothing has changed the overall big picture.
That's right. And it seems unlikely to change with any number of future finds of new variety of Australopiths or of archaic humans, for that matter. The reason's pretty straightforward. The notion that humans evolved from ape-like creatures is simply wrong.
Okay.
So conclusion about the Australopithecines. Lucy's a knuckle-walking primate. Everything about her matches very closely to a chimpanzee. It's a type of primate that lived and went extinct. But there's one other conclusion. Lucy had nothing to do with the Laetoli Trail. And as you might guess, those human prints are not 3.7 million years old. And so that mystery remains in our future to discuss, and that is on this matter of radiometric dating. So what to do with the evidence? And that's really the question, right? We've got so much now. What do we do with the overwhelming evidence about these Australopithecines? What do we do with the overwhelming evidence about the Laetoli Trail? What do we do with this? How do we present it? Well, I went to the Smithsonian's website to see how it's presented as of this morning. And here's what it says. I looked up the Laetoli footprint trails, and it goes on to say, the Laetoli footprints were most likely made by Australopithecus afarensis, an early human whose fossils were found in the same sediment layer. The entire footprint trail is almost 27 meters, 88 feet long, and includes impressions of about 70 early human footprints. We could go on to say that had been attributed to two adults and one child. 3.6 million years ago in Laetoli, Tanzania, 3 early humans, in this case they would be Australopithecines, walked through wet volcanic ash when the nearby volcano erupted again. Subsequent layers of ash covered and presented the oldest known footprints of early humans. This is not true. There is so much evidence that says this is not true. The Australopithecines could not have made that trail. The evidence is overwhelming. And yet this has continued to be heralded as of today from the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History's website. Meanwhile, I do want to say one other thing. At this point, I think we need to make a new entry into the Hall of Shame, and that is the Australopithecines. Not because they're not real, but because of how they've been presented, because of all the mischaracterizations, because of all the manipulation of the information. They too should enter the Hall of Shame. But at this point, evidence is coming in that helps bring greater clarity. And in fact, the cave in Spain made everything plain. In 1992, in a cave in Spain, Juan Luis Arzuaga and colleagues found an undisturbed burial pit where 33 individuals had been buried. Now, these are all dating to 400,000 years ago. That's evolutionary time. Don't worry, we'll talk more about time in the future. The cranial characteristics in this one find indicated 7 similarities with Homo erectus, 7 similarities with Homo sapiens, and 10 similarities with Neanderthals. Now, I want you to think about that. Do we really believe that Homo erectus, if they were some other species, and ancient Homo sapiens, if they were some other species, and Neanderthals, if they were some other species, all buried their dead together? Imagine that. Did they have a conversation about it? The extreme variation within the people group in this one cave where they buried the dead erases all of our supposed distinction in a second. The cave in Spain makes everything plain. But there's another entry we need to make into the Hall of Shame. And that's the portrayal. You see, what has been happening is every Homo is, outside of Homo sapiens, is portrayed as slightly monkey-looking, while every Australopithecus, every chimpanzee-like creature, is given a more and more portrayal of looking more human than they really did, attempting to build the case of a supposed evolution from one to the other when it is nowhere to be found in the evidence itself. Marvin Lubenow said this in his book, Bones of Contention. The human species, Homo sapiens, ancient, Homo erectus, and Neanderthals have been downplayed to look ape-like. Primate species, Homo habilis, we talked about that, it's really an ape, and Australopithecus have been upplayed to look more human. Careful study proves this point rather easily. In conclusion, God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let man have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." You and I are not the result of time and chance. We're not the supposed result of molecules, of pond scum to man, of monkey to man evolution. You and I are created by a sovereign and awesome God, and we're created in his image. You and I are fearfully and wonderfully made. And because that is true, our Creator has expectations on us. Our Creator makes demands upon us. And our Creator desires to have a relationship with us in spite of the fact that we've disobeyed our Creator for so long. You see, that is the story. That is what God's Word presents. Brothers and sisters in Christ, I present to you a discussion rooted in Genesis. What about the supposed evolution of man? Until we meet again in Sunday school this coming Sunday, God bless you. Look forward to seeing you Sunday. Talk to you then.